Mike Martin is the Liberal Democrat MP for Royal Tunbridge Wells and member of the Defence Select Committee. Thanks for coming on the programme, Mr Martin. What do you make of Steve Witkoff's arguments there?
Look, I think with any Trump administration officials, you've got to cut through the noise and get to the heart of what's going on. So to put aside the comments that he made about the Prime Minister's efforts, I think fundamentally what we have to recognise is that a peace deal in Ukraine is very, very difficult to reach, right? Russia and Ukraine have fundamentally different ideas about the role of Ukraine and the role of its sovereignty and whether it can choose its own allies. Russia says no, and Ukraine says, quite rightly, we're a sovereign country and we're going to choose our own alliances. And that hasn't changed, despite the fact that Trump is saying we're going to have a peace deal and they're going and sending envoys and emissaries and all the rest of it. That fundamental difference has not changed.
Why would it be sensible for Ukraine to join NATO?
Because otherwise it's likely to get invaded by Russia. And that's exactly what's happened. And as we see in Eastern Europe, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia and Poland are all in NATO. And since Russia's invaded Ukraine, which was not in NATO, Finland and Sweden have joined NATO as a direct result of that. So NATO, with its collective defence, so an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us, defends us and helps us keep safe.
Do you not think the fact that Putin has shown himself to be willing on a number of occasions to attack Ukraine means that it would be unwise for that country to join NATO even if it wanted to, because we'd be involved in a conflict with Russia pretty quickly?
So you can't join NATO whilst you've got a conflict going on, because that would immediately trigger the Article 5 and then all the other countries would get dragged in. But during the Cold War, for instance, after the division of Germany, Western Germany did join NATO at that point. But there is a big problem here, and that is that whilst Ukraine wants to join NATO and most European states support that, America under Trump has said no, there is no pathway to NATO. And within NATO, all the current members get a veto on whether new states get to join. So that's a big problem that we have. And this speaks to the heart of the peace deal or not, and whether there are going to be troops going in, whether Americans are going to support those troops. And so there are a number of problems that make this peace deal really, really, really difficult, if not impossible, actually, to bring into force.
And do you think even if we were to get to a stage where there was sufficient guarantee of peace that meant that this coalition of the willing needs to start showing itself, that British troops would be stationed in eastern Ukraine, patrolling the border, putting drones up to see what Russian tanks might or might not be doing, that would be a way of guaranteeing Ukraine's peace?
So if we take the assumption that a peace deal could be made over and above all of those problems that we've just spoken about, then in principle, of course, British troops should be working with other countries, including the US, should be working in Ukraine to ensure that peace. But then that opens up another question, Tom, which is that the British military, the British Army, the field army is actually 40,000 troops, and 10,000 of those are currently deployed. So that leaves 30,000 troops. So this does not leave very many troops to deploy to Ukraine, whilst also maintaining a reserve, a strategic reserve for the UK to defend itself. So I think if we want to go into Ukraine, we need to look at increasing defence expenditure and the size of the army, at least up to 100,000 troops.
Very finally, what do you make of what you heard from Steve Witkoff there, the man who is responsible for negotiating with Russia and Ukraine, effectively saying we trust Putin not to invade Ukraine again? Are you surprised by that?
I think that's just complete nonsense. They invaded Ukraine in 2014, and then we did a peace deal without teeth, and then they invaded again in 2022. And it's not a question of whether, if there's a peace deal, that they won't try and have another go. Of course they will. It's actually whether they're going to have a go at Estonia or some of the other countries. We have British troops in Estonia. Under Estonian command defending Estonia. There's a huge amount of risk there for the UK. I think the big question for the UK government at the moment is whether they continue with their strategy, which is to bridge between the Trump administration and Europe. And I personally think that strategy is in tatters, because the US administration is deeply, deeply unreliable, the current administration, Or does the UK pivot its military and diplomatic efforts to working with our European partners to ensure collective defence in Europe with all of those partners? And I would include Ukraine in that. They have a huge army. It's well versed in fighting the Russians. And just to pick one example, they're the world leader in drone technology, which is very important in warfare at the moment. I think this is a big, big turning point for British geostrategic policy, and I don't feel that the government has recognised that the world is changing and that we need to change direction.
Good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on. Mike Martin, Lib Dem MP for Tunbridge Wells, member of the Defence Select Committee.